All right, welcome to the SIG Auth call for Wednesday, January 24th, 2018. We had a short agenda, which is getting longer as we as we wait. So let's go ahead and jump in and see where we end up. There weren't any new polls referenced, though I'm not sure that's accurate. I'm trying to think what's happened since the last time we met. There was one update, which for people who are doing the audit, interested in the audit work, the RBAC authorizer now returns the reason why a particular request was authorized, including the role and role binding and the subject that allowed the request, which is handy. We're looking at pulling that information into audit logs. There's a pull request to do that. So there will soon be more information in your audit logs if you're trying to figure out why a particular request was allowed, which is nice. And when audit hooks up to include that, that would also bring back reasons that were returned from like the webhook authorizer as well. So we pick that up no matter what the authorizer is.
I was just going to ask that. Thank you.
Nothing else is springing to mind for recent polls, but if you have something, go ahead and throw it in there. We can jump down to new designs. All right, Eric, did you want to talk about the OIDC bump or just make people aware of that?
Just make people aware. I sometimes have trouble contacting all of the people who use that plugin, but
I don't hear you. Are you muted?
Am I muted? I can
hear him.
Can people not hear me anymore?
I can hear you.
Am I muted?
I can hear you too, Jordan.
Anyway, we can continue, but if anybody uses the OIDC plugin, please take a look at that.
Jordan, can you hear me? Jordan, can you hear anyone? Wow, he's going to do an awesome job in this meeting, guys.
It really sounded like he could hear us.
Well, so he's not talking now, but Eric was talking. Jordan, are you? Okay. I'm going to go see if Jordan's still there, and I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Jordan. I didn't realize no one could hear me.
Oh, we could hear you.
Oh, well, I couldn't hear anyone else, so great. I thought everyone was just being really quiet. All right, well, here we go. Yeah, so Eric, did you already talk about the OIDC poll?
Yeah.
Great. Where are we? I don't know what's going on. All right, new designs. There was the validated pod annotations. We covered that already while I was having difficulties.
We have not covered that yet.
Okay. Do you want to kind of explain the motivation for this and where it's at?
Yeah, I think it's pretty terribly named currently. The problem, there's a specific problem that we're trying to solve, and this is a potential solution. The problem is we can, once service account tokens are useful for integration with external systems, we would we can implicitly grant some access to credentials to pods, and Kubernetes really has no way of knowing about that. What we would like to do is to, I'll say we as in GCP and GKEIM, what we would like to do is to prevent a a user of a Kubernetes cluster from accessing credentials that to a service account or a secret that the user did not have express permission to use. And ways that you can sort of get implicit access to the pod's runtime environment is by being able to exec into the pod is the most obvious one, but also being able to update or deploy pods with a specific Kubernetes service account. So this proposes a way of dispatching extra subject access reviews on top of the normal subject access reviews for operations on a pod that might grant access to the pod's runtime environment. Has anybody had a chance to read the problem statement? Sounds like the answer is no.
I had looked over it. I was trying to understand whether these checks were being done at the API server level or the kubelet level prior to going out and requesting these additional credentials. Were these annotations that indicated that access to the guts of the pod would give access to these things, and so
Right.
we would have to check prior to giving access to the pod, or were they actually driving access to those other things? Like, this would indicate to the kubelet, you should go out and get a GCE or GCP service account credential and inject it.
The first. It's basically a hint because if you think about it, all kubelet in an exchange model, all kubelet knows about is the Kubernetes token. So if the kubelet is not, so we would only be checking this at admission time for the specific actions that allow access to the pod runtime environment.
Okay, and what's the source of these annotations?
What do you mean by the source?
So the annotation is a hint to something, I guess an admission plugin that says if you want to exec or attach or change the image of, or in some other way access the innards of a pod that has one of these annotations, run these extra checks. Who is setting those hints on pods?
So the creator of the pod. So something like if I am running in a namespace and I want to use a Google service account with a pod that I'm running, I would add that Google service account as in a validated annotation fields on the pod. I would run control create, and beyond the specific, am I allowed to run a pod in this namespace? The admission controller would dispatch another subject access review, which is the user allowed to use this specific validated annotation?
Okay, so but doesn't that mean the check is based on the person creating the pod accurately representing what the pod is going to give them access to?
Yeah, so at the bottom of the document, there's a description about how an external system should integrate with validated pod annotations. And basically, the proposal is to propagate validated annotations in the Kubernetes private claims. The Kubernetes ID token private claims to propagate the validated annotations in the standard in arguments to a flex volume, and also the external system could read the Kubernetes API server directly, and the external system would have to say, a pod is only allowed access to this specific whatever the annotation refers to if it is running with that validated annotation.
Okay, so it is actually driving
whether or not the pod has access to the thing.
It is an extra check, whether it's driving or not.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say it potentially drives. I think it's just a way to centralize the policy around these things. I see Evan on the call, and we saw his presentation about how you would integrate SPIFFE identities into Kubernetes by defining policy elsewhere to map Kubernetes. This pod in this namespace gets access to this SPIFFE identity. You could, alternatively, using the validated pod annotations, define that through RBAC, and then just have the Spire control plane or whatever trust that if I trust this Kubernetes API server to validate things correctly, then I can trust the validated assertion that it's making on this pod.
Yeah. I think we probably have the things in place that you could prototype this with webhook admission and a flex volume.
Yeah,
I'd
we
be
do.
interested to see kind of what you run into in practice, like especially with the propagation bits. That seems like that would be the stickiest thing, like getting everything in the chain to propagate.
Yeah.
So it ends up on the pod the right way.
Yeah. Right. There's some stickiness around API extensions, but we can definitely prototype this. I wanted to gauge whether this is a common enough or useful enough feature to standardize the API. I think a bad situation to get in would be to have everybody do something different.
Yeah, I think this gets into how do you express a request for external credential types of things.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that seems like the first.
But this at least allows us to use the same sort of mechanism as annotations with a little bit of extra guarantee that there was some check that occurred.
Yeah.
So are your reservations that you don't think this is generally useful, or that it is not general enough to be useful across many external integrations?
I don't know. It seems like you would need to express two things. One is the external credential or thing that you wanted access to, and then also a generic way to pair that or express that as a subject access review. And the second is the thing I'm unsure about, whether you can map every type of external credential you're going to want to request access to a subject access review.
Not so much whether it's possible, but how it could reasonably be done, I assume, right? I can envision making it possible with enough information, but it would look really weird.
Yeah, or whether you would want the cube authorization system to be giving thumbs up or thumbs down to access to external credentials. I'm a little unclear about how the handoff between those two would work.
I think you're already implicitly giving the cube authorization system a lot of power by your ability to create pods, and then if you're going to use that information to say this pod in this namespace has this access. So I think it's just moving one more of that piece potentially into the cube policy world. Potentially, if you would like.
Yeah.
And then you can answer that either through RBAC or whatever authorizer you have configured. Like on GKE, we would love to, direct this directly into the IAM checks on GCP that we need to do.
I think seeing it prototyped out using something other than Core Cube to do that prototype would make it a little bit easier to see both exactly how you would use it and how it would be, right? You can look at access to a pod in terms of if I if you have access to this pod in this namespace or any pod in this namespace, you just have access to everything in the namespace. And this, it feels like it's an attempt to subdivide that. Otherwise, you would just control access at the namespace level. And
well, so the problem is that indirection through the namespace. So the alternative to this is to force people to adopt that indirection. And the specific worry here is the actual credential. We care less about the services that point to a pod, any other resource. It's specifically about access to the credential. And the alternative is adopt the namespace indirection, and that's just how Kubernetes works.
All right. In the interest of time, let's continue this discussion on the design.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. I think the KMS, gRPC KMS proposal got merged. The pull, I think, is ready. I had one question that was outstanding from the last time we talked, which was the question about versioning. The versioning elements of the design are lifted pretty directly from the way the kubelet has its gRPC APIs versioned. And I was hoping that someone with a clear picture of how that would actually play out if we needed to bump the version of this would work. I don't have a lot of experience with how gRPC is versioned in general or how the kubelet is planning to version its API. And so I was wondering if someone else did and could explain that. Apparently my line's broken again because I can't hear all of you talking.
Not so lucky.
I guess I'll ask Seth or Derek when we start reviewing the poll.
Okay.
It is on my list to review in the next couple days.
Okay.
but a second pair of eyes more familiar with gRPC would be really useful.
We might be able to get somebody from that CG team to go take a look because they use gRPC heavily.
That'd be much appreciated.
Can we get someone to tag people into that so we can get that? We'd really like to see that in. All right. The next one on the list, the pod security policy API is one of the APIs in the infamous extensions API group, which we are trying to find homes for all of the objects in that group. And so there's a poll open to move that into an API group. The poll is green. I think it is mechanically sound. It is basically pending a decision on the group name. So if there are opinions, and ideally opinions backed by precedent and consistency with other things we're doing, those would be welcomed in the poll, and we'll try to get that closed out with the API review and approval process. All right. Client Go auth provider proposal. Eric, you want to give the status on this?
Yeah, so this is the ability for Client Go to exec a plugin to provide credentials. This has gone through a couple iterations of the proposal. The thing we sort of landed on is that there will be structured input and output to the plugin. So the plugin will receive some structured information about maybe the runtime. There's nothing explicitly provided, or there's nothing proposed about the input yet, but the output will also be structured. So the output will expect it to be JSON structured thing with a field called token that then it then will be used by Client Go. There were some concerns around sort of caching. I think we landed on a pretty reasonable strategy there, which is that if you exec it and provide an expiry, Client Go will respect that expiry. If you don't, then it will just sort of hold on to it until it hits a 401.
And if you hit an expiry, if you provide an expiry and it hits a 401, does that immediately expire and call you again?
All of our current plugins do that, so
Okay.
we will probably maintain that pattern for the initial set. And then other than that, I think that's the only significant changes. So there were some questions around SSHing and bastion host, and I don't think that this is the correct place to address that, but maybe someone else has different opinions on that.
I'm sorry, could you say that again? There were questions about?
There were questions about if this could be used to, there were some comments that a lot of people use bastion hosts before they allow people to connect via to the API server, and if this could be used to help expedite some of those processes. I don't think so initially, but I haven't given that a whole lot of thought.
Yeah.
But I don't.
That seems like more of a proxy setting type of issue, like making sure we respect proxy and let you set up a bastion and then route through it.
Yeah. So I think it mostly just, I think this is the final version that, at least I'm comfortable with this being sort of the final version, saying that people should leave their final comments if we want to get to that point.
Okay. The call pattern seemed reasonable to me. The format of the structured data we provide and structured data we receive. I don't want to underspecify that, but I don't also want to overspecify it. So can we come up with a minimal thing that also seems like we can support and extend if we need to?
Yeah, so the input has 0 things specified, so I don't know if that's underspecified too much. The output of the plugin is just sort of flat fields right now. We could potentially have something like a spec or have different types of things, but we go into a little bit further how we might extend this to X509 certs. I think that gives a good idea of how the plugin will evolve, that the API will evolve.
For the input, we are anticipating being able to pipe through user input, right? So that it could prompt for a username and password type of thing?
The input have to be passed through, and the proposal right now passes that input through an environment variable, specifically so we can use standard in for prompting and user input.
Yeah, and as I recall seeing it, you had it set up so it was going to be a JSON encode, or JSON inside was the way it was specified?
Yeah.
Okay, no, I'm not saying I want to do that. I'm just, so it seems like we do have one thing at least to put in there. We have to indicate to the plugin whether this is the I'm calling you on first initialization, or this is the HTTP status that I got back from my failed request, right? So you have at least one thing to spec in there.
Okay. Yeah, we can add that in.
Okay. So yeah, take a look at that if you haven't already, and leave final comments, and we'll make progress on that as well. All right, Greg, you want to talk about audit? I don't see Greg. Who else?
Greg couldn't make the meeting. He asked me to
Tim.
talk about it.
Okay.
I'm actually not sure how much there is to say here. We want to bring advanced audit logging to V1 in the 1.10 release. There's a few open issues, but I think the general consensus, at least among our team, is that most of the remaining features and work can be done in a backwards compatible way post V1, and isn't kind of critical core functionality that we have to have before then.
I know for other V1 types of things, frequently we would wait to promote the API to V1 until sort of the scale issues and performance issues had been ironed out. Do we feel like that is where it needs to be for audit?
I think
I know that the main thing was like running our scale tests with audit enabled. That was kind of the thing that we had to disable and we could do that because it was in beta. Do we want to require running with this on and passing performance targets?
Yeah, I definitely agree that should be a blocker.
Okay.
I can't remember if the fix to get that re-enabled was merged or not. But yes, I agree with that.
Okay.
There were two other things that occurred to me. One was working with aggregated API servers like the service catalog. And I think I saw a comment from Stefan saying arguments are all there, and it was short, like a way to specify what server it originated from, which is a problem I'd like to see resolved. And then I remember seeing an issue a while back where someone wanted to be able to add like almost annotation information on the audit event to indicate the PSP status, and not PSP as like I really want my PSP here, but that request of I have context on this request that I'd like to have included in the audit, and how would we handle that? It doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing.
Yeah, so those are both features that we definitely want to add. From my perspective, those both feel like things that could go in post V1. They're kind of adding to the functionality. And they might go in 110, but I don't feel like they need to block V1 from my perspective.
Well, some of these things drive the shape of our other hooks. Right, I'm thinking about, say, the admission hooks in particular. They end up having to get but this does. And something like what server does this come from, that's going to directly affect all the sync behavior, right? Like, so it's not that it isn't additive from an API side, but it does affect several other consumers, right? It affects the syncs and it affects our other webhooks.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I guess the question is, does it fall above or below the feature? Do we is V1 like feature complete, or is it minimum viable product? And I think what we have now is kind of minimum viable product, and there are a couple pretty significant things before we would say, yeah, feature complete. Like you can actually trace something across servers, and so yeah, where do we want to draw the V1 line, I guess?
And I would look at something like we have webhook admission now, and I would really like to be able to relate my audit calls and add details.
I guess one question is Kubernetes is full of moving targets, and if we put audit logging to V1, then it feels like we put the burden on new features to add audit support basically as they come out. As long as audit's not in V1, I think the burden is a little more on the audit developers to support the new features that are coming out. Does that make sense?
It does, but right now I don't. The other pieces of the system don't have the ability to plug into it, right? I mean, like the metadata that we need to provide. Yeah, so I would look at it like, yeah, I'd really like to, but I need to have that metadata.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, that's not to say that we're not close. I mean, I think the work on enabling other components to annotate or contribute information to the audit stuff is in progress. Do we want to plan to promote it to V1, assuming that other stuff can be done? And say, if we don't figure out how the rest of the system is supposed to interact with audit, then we probably shouldn't promote it to V1 yet?
That sounds pretty fair to me.
Yep.
Okay.
Because I agree, it's fairly close. It's just that these plug points are important.
Okay. So Tim, can you link the performance scale piece in there if that was already done?
Yeah, I'll follow up on that.
All right, thanks. Okay. No, I think this next one was yours.
Yeah, so I just want to get people's thoughts on adding a subject rules review API, which would be the sort of mirror API of the subject rules. So it's sort of like self-SAR versus SAR, to be able to ask what can a user do across a namespace, all the things. Logically, the use case we have is that a SAR doesn't work in this case because we have to ask a lot of questions. So like it becomes unreasonable when you have to do like 20 SARs to answer a question. So like I just kind of want to get people's ideas on like if this is something you would want, because what it ends up being is you do a SAR, or sorry, a subject rules review, and then you do a logical coverage check yourself to make sure that it covered what you wanted to actually know. So it doesn't fully cover like, making it a nice entry point for a consumer, but it does allow them to actually do it if they're willing to do the coverage check themselves.
Well,
Yeah.
so the thing that I remember is that Eric made the subject rules review, and then we promptly had the problem of how do you handle explicit denies. And as I recall it, that API still doesn't handle it.
Yeah, that there was a PR open to add support from webhook, which included changes to the API that did expressed explicit denies. That PR probably needs a little bit of update at some point. It was a big one, and there wasn't many people reviewing it, so I haven't been updating it actively.
Yeah. In terms of the solution to the problem, though, we had talked about a couple, but I don't know if we settled on one.
The one that is in the PR is that the returned rules are ordered and that they have either explicit denies. They also have a Boolean for explicit deny. So a front end evaluating it would have to know that they're ordered and know that explicit deny means deny.
So I would summarize my position, Mo, as I am interested in it, but I'm not interested in having a second broken API, which means fixing the first API first.
Yeah.
I would actually ask if there's a different API that could solve that need. I see the subject rules review as more of a audit tool, and it sounds like what you're looking for is a bulk subject access review. So can you talk more about the use case that you're wanting?
Yeah, so in OpenShift, we already have the subject rules review API, which won't necessarily support from the explicit deny scenario because we don't wire up authorizers to do that other than, well, I guess we have the scope authorizer. But we have some brokers from Service Catalog that run sort of very arbitrary code, and they like to check the privileges of the users who are invoking requests against them before running random things on their behalf. And since they don't necessarily know a priori what the thing they're going to be running is, we can't easily do like checks of like, can you get pods or something or anything like that. So they check more of, are you an admin in the namespace? Yes? Okay, I'll do this thing for you. Otherwise, no, I won't do it for you, or something along those lines, right? And the meaning
I don't think we want to encourage external evaluation of policy in an authoritative way.
The self-subject rules review explicitly says that this should not be used for that use case.
Yeah, but in the concept of, well, what can I do? It is useful to be able to do, right? It has a similar bearing to what the initial subject rules review that Eric made was for, right? Like it was a case of web console wants to look and decide, well, which button should I enable here? I'm not authoritative, but if you can't do this, I shouldn't have this button because I know it's just never going to work. And this is the similar sort of thing for a user just saying, well, what can I do in this namespace? And that's pretty useful for that.
I would still argue that the web console should use a bulk subject access review. It should say, I want to enable buttons for these 4 actions. So I'm going to ask about these 4 resource verb combos and evaluate, yes on list pods, but no on create pods. As opposed to saying, tell me all of the permissions, and then I'm going to iterate through that list and figure out the ones that I actually cared about. I think that is still super useful for an auditor that's going to say, this person's credentials were compromised. Let me see all of the things they could have done in that time.
Yeah. So sounds like not now. No.
But if you want to fix subject rules review, that would be great.
Yeah.
I'm not in any rush. I was trying to get an idea of where the community was on the standpoint of this. So if I gathered correctly, you guys would not want someone externally to ever do a coverage check. You would rather have the server do it if there was ever such an API to use.
Yeah. Especially in the case, like imagine you're using a webhook authorizer that doesn't actually instantiate its policy. And so it's not going to be able to return self-subject rules review. Like it's not going to be able to enumerate all the things. Yeah, if you are going to use this to gate the user from doing things, then I want it to be server evaluated.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Yep. All right, Mike. I think you're up.
Yeah, this is the token request proposal. It seems like comments have dried up on it. I was wondering if anybody had anything further they wanted to see from it, or if we can get it in and start working on getting the APIs merged. I.e. further discussion happens on the API PR.
I think the only open question I had was the way you express a request for an expiring versus a non-expiring token.
Right.
I know you had wanted to partition, like try to make it possible to have 2 signing keys, one that is for non-expiring things and then one that they can rotate. And
yeah.
go ahead.
I think that I didn't necessarily want that. I just thought that it was a possibility. And the more I think about like actually partitioning that key ring, the more I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
But I think that questions like that can be continued. We can continue to discuss questions like that on the actual API change PR. If everybody thinks that there's nothing glaringly wrong with the proposal. Do people feel comfortable with that?
Did we settle on what the audience for the API server, like the local API server that grants the token would be?
Isn't the audience empty currently for the service account tokens?
Yeah, so we will continue to accept JOTs without audiences to support the legacy ID tokens. I had commented, and I don't think anybody responded, that I was going to first use the Kubernetes service account DNS name as the audience for expiring tokens in the token authenticator. And potentially if people were interested or it was desired, we could configure the authenticator to expand the list of audiences that the token authenticator accepted.
Does MD just work for, this is for the API server and the exceptional cases that you get an audience for an external service?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
I can follow up on the PR. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think in the case where you request a token and you don't indicate what the audience is, you get one for the API server. Is that right, Mike?
From the token request API? Yes, or we can make it a required field. Semantics like that, I think that we can, do you think it's valuable for us to continue to discuss specific semantics of the API on the proposal, or would you, is that where you would prefer to discuss questions like this?
I'd like to see like a sample request and response and kind of here's how I'd request an expiring one, here's how I'd request a non-expiring one, here's how I'd request one for the API and for someone else.
Okay.
It seems like example flow is useful in the proposal. And then if like a field name changes or something, that's fine. But it's just easier to reason through like how would this appear and work from the outside before we get into the code.
All right, I will take that as an action item to add that information to the PR, and I'll ping you guys when it's ready. Did you guys want to discuss, I think we can discuss expiring and non-expiring on the PR, that's small enough, but I wanted to get your feedback on the versioning of the sub-resource. Is this a nut we have to crack for to get token request in, or?
Well, once we add a sub-resource to V1, we're stuck with that forever. Yeah. So my inclination would be to have a V1 that matches. And then if we want to iterate or change the structure of it, we do that in a groupified beta version. The fact that this doesn't persist anything is nice. We don't have any data in a TD we ever have to like store or migrate for this. Mm-hmm. So it's purely a functional API that we would have to maintain, and that doesn't seem too burdensome. I just hate the wart of replication controller scale being stuck with extensions view and beta 1 scale forever, and want to avoid the same thing with this. Yeah,
that was my feeling too.
I'll try to get Clayton, and I'm trying to think who else would care. I'll try to get some of the API reviewers around to that, and see if we can move forward with that.
Okay, and the one question that's not listed, is there any concern with expanding local object reference to have UID and type as well? There was a to-do to extend the local object reference to support that.
Yeah, that was long ago, and I think since then we have regretted every generically reusable reference object we created. So I would make a fit-to-purpose struct.
That sounds good. Yeah. I will change that as well.
Yeah.
All right, that covers everything that I wanted to discuss over video. Thank you.
Yep. I didn't put it on here. My intent is to work on the label and taint aspects in the next couple weeks and see if I can move that forward for 110. I don't know that I've seen progress on the node self-reported address aspects. That's still important. It's just not top of the list right now.
What were the outstanding concerns for that aspect of the PR?
Which?
The node IP addresses.
Well, there hasn't been a really concrete proposal about how we change the flow from self-reported to self-reported but unverified, or externally reported.
Okay.
so there are two sides. One is getting the kubelet to reorder how it starts up and where the serving portion of the kubelet gets its address info from. But the other part is making sure that the information is in the API so that we can transition smoothly from this self-reported world to an externally managed and verified world.
So the proposal, from my understanding, proposed that there would be an initializer, that something would remove that initializer once it had canonically sort of determined the IPs or addresses.
I would like to not block solving this on initializers whose fate is uncertain at this point. Okay. Initializers also don't help us with migrating existing nodes. So I would like to represent the verified or unverified or self-reported or non-self-reported, however we want to phrase that, nature of a kubelet's addresses in the API. And then that lets a particular deployment decide, you know what, I don't care about self-reported things, just give them whatever serving cert they want. Or a cloud provider managed deployment to be able to say, nope, only give serving certs to things that the cloud provider has come in and said, yep, that's the right address. I think initializers are, it's not clear that those are going to be functional in the time frame where we would want the TLS serving stuff to be progressing.
It also has occurred to me in the past that we can hackily solve some of this outside of Kubernetes in the signer implementation. So, for example, like GKE doesn't do this, and we don't really plan on doing this. But if we really wanted to get serving certificates that were signed by the root CA in GKE clusters, we could have the signer on a request for a kubelet server certificate validate against GCE APIs that the IP addresses were what we expected them to be.
Or the approver, actually. Right now, we are wanting approval to happen without regard to cloud provider aspects. But if you had a cloud provider approver that was verifying the things that got requested were valid, you could do it there as well.
Yeah, that works too. We only run a custom signer. We actually just use the open source subject access review approver. The one thing that the signer can do right now that the approver cannot is it can modify the certificate template before it is signed. So it can do stuff like add sans. I don't know, did you guys see the question from somebody on the SIG Auth mailing list recently about their experience working with the certificates API?
I don't think I saw that.
Somebody had forked the init container, the certificate init container that Kelsey Hightower wrote, and they had complained that that init container needs a lot of read permission on the API to actually gather what sans it needs to put into the certificate signing request. If instead they could have sent a certificate signing request with a template pod and allowed the signer to fill in the appropriate subject sans, then all they would need was access to the to post to the certificates API and read from the certificates API rather than broader read permissions. And also there's some performance implications and with that. So this is kind of like a similar case where kubelet should just request. It's possible that if we implemented this functionality, there could be a world where the kubelet requests a server certificate but does not specify in the CSR any specifics about that server certificate, and we allow the signer to fill in the gaps.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, basically, I think that we should solve the taints and toleration or taints and labels separately and kind of revisit server certificates.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'm planning to work on the labels and taints aspect, and we can continue trying to figure out what we're going to do with addresses. All right, we have a few minutes left. Does anyone have anything they want to talk about, or give you 8 minutes back?
Quick follow-up question for Eric, if he still thinks that 110 is realistic for the client operator plugin?
Yeah, I will make sure that I or someone else gets a PR in soon. And then I think the plan is for it to be alpha in 110.
Awesome.
All right, well, let's call it there. And follow up on the issues and polls and mailing list. And see you guys online. Thanks.